Today is September 15th. My name is Patty Bernard and we are in Reno, Nevada. This interview is a series of interviews funded with the generosity of the Robert Z Hawkins Foundation. Today we are talking with Jane Torres, who is a communication specialist at the University of Nevada. Jane, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here and to be part of this.
We are quite honored to have you. Jane, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and where you were from?
Sure. I was born in Lovelock, so I'm a native Nevadan and grew up there. And my father had a business there, and then fast forwarding through high school graduation, I came to the University of Nevada, Reno. I was one of those young people who was looking at a lot of different universities, couldn't make a decision, decided to come to Reno thinking I would move on, and here I am. I ended up getting my degree at the university, meeting my husband in Reno, and then spending my career in Reno.
And what is your husband's name?
His name is Ryan Torres.
And your parents?
My parents are Pete and Gloria Fundus.
And you are a native Nevadan. Are you multi-generational or?
Yes, my mother's parents are Basque immigrants. We're Basque immigrants, and came to this country and have what is to me an amazing story. My grandfather was a sheep herder. My grandmother came over and was she would say she was a servant, but worked for wealthy people. And at one point they ended up in Jack Creek, which is out of Elko, and ran a small Basque hotel. And if you know about Jack Creek, it's even hard to imagine that you could scrape a living out of owning a hotel or a boarding house in a town that small, but they did. And they ended up starting a business, and it was successful. It was a business that was in Battle Mountain, and carried them through their professional lives, but wonderful people. My father moved here when he was young. His father came out of Oklahoma. Lots of families were leaving that part of our country at the time for economic reasons. And he was part of a crew that was building airports in semi-rural areas, and they built the airport in Lovelock, and he ended up staying there with his family and having a business as well.
So your mom grew up technically in Lovelock?
My mom grew up in Battle Mountain.
In Battle Mountain.
And my dad grew up in Lovelock. And so my mother has a wonderful sense of humor, and she would often point out that there's a river that runs through northern Nevada, the Humboldt River, and it starts in the Battle Mountain area, and then the end of the river is outside of Lovelock. So she says her life followed the Humboldt River.
That's kind of neat. And do you have siblings?
I do. I'm the oldest of three. I have a sister, Kay, and a brother, John. And my sister is married, and she's an anesthesiologist, a practicing physician in Seattle. And my brother is in Dallas, Texas, where he's an attorney.
And you went through a series of steps then as you became a communications director. Was this your first choice for a career, or did this come with a group of directions on different areas?
Yeah, that's an interesting question for me, and it reminds me of someone who was very influential in my life at that time. I was a faculty member at the journalism school, and he was very adamant about talking to us as students and saying we needed a 5-year plan. And I've jokingly told him even in the last several years that I still don't have a 5-year plan. I didn't have it then, don't have it now. But I was in the journalism school, the journalism program at the university, and I wanted to be a reporter. But I ended up taking classes from John Broder, who grew up in Reno and ended up creating what was one of the top highly recognized public relations firms in our country. And so having him as a faculty member and understanding what communications and public relations is from that very ethical, professional point of view, I was hooked. He asked me to do an internship for him, and my career has followed that path.
Did you participate in activities in high school in journalistic classes, or did you just simply come to UNR and say, I want to be a journalist?
I did. I went to Pershing County High School, which was a very fine high school, but we didn't have maybe the breadth of some of those kinds of opportunities that you might have in bigger schools. But I worked on the yearbook, worked on the newspaper. They just weren't expansive experiences. But I actually did spend a summer working at the newspaper, the Lovelock Review-Minor. And let's see, I would have been 18 at the time. Really had very little experience, but they gave me a try and had me writing for the paper. And that was really wonderful to be a part of finding stories and telling stories and learning how to write.
Following along your career, Jane, what kind of activities and accomplishments have you done on your path to communications director at the university?
Well, I was in the journalism program, as I said, at the university. Had an amazing faculty member who tapped me, asked me to do an internship with him. He did a lot of client work. That kind of took me into a job at Harrah's. We did a project with Harrah's. I ended up being there for 10 years, and of course I was young. I mean, those were, for me professionally, those were very formative years, but I did work in internal communications, a little bit of governmental affairs. Came out of that and went to work at Washoe Health System. And I would be remiss if I didn't comment that in my years at Harrah's, I didn't work for Lynn Atchison, but I worked with Lynn Atchison. And she really built a very prominent community relations program at Harrah's. And again, that was just absolutely formative for me because I did many, many projects with her and really learned sort of that whole idea of corporate responsibility and corporate citizenship. Lynn moved on, went to Washoe Health System, which is today renowned, and when she got there, she asked me if I would consider applying for a position to work for her there. And I did. So I suppose it would be fair to say that I followed Lynn to Washoe Health System and spent 10 years there. After that, I spent a year at an advertising agency, the Estepona Group, and this position had opened at the university, and I applied for it and got it. I was communications director for the University of Nevada, Reno for 11 years, and then about a year and a half ago, kind of got to the point where I decided I was ready for a change, and it was just time for a change for a number of reasons. So I'm now research communications director, which is a part-time role at the university.
And what do you do in that role?
Well, we really move the news and information of the university, and that would be the same for when I was at Washoe Health System, when I was at Harrah's, when I was in other capacities. But we really seek to do it in a way that we're telling stories, we're relating information, but that hopefully we're creating a larger narrative about what the organization is or what's being accomplished. And so for my years as communications director of the university, those were very dynamic years, and a word we focused on a lot was momentum. So we were trying to tell stories, daily, day-to-day kinds of stories at the university, but that really helped our community understand that there were some really important positive things happening at the university. It was growing in terms of enrollment, but even in terms of the quality of education that was happening there. So the same is true now. I'm in research communication. So my quest is to help our community understand what the university does in terms of research and the impact that a research program has, and then also how the university connects to the economy. I work much more on that area as well now in my current position.
And this communication is going out to other organizations, other researchers. Are you, or is the university trying to pull in other researchers into the university system, or is this more for community-wide?
Right. A little bit of all of the above. So being in communications, we really work across audiences. And maybe what I should throw in that I think probably what we're best known for is the media relations role. So when reporters want information from the university, when there's a crisis at the university, when there's an issue, positive or maybe not so positive, we tend to be the individuals that facilitate those and facilitate moving the information out. But the communications role is broader than just media relations. So for example, if we're making an announcement, we're thinking across audiences, everything from making sure that we're sharing the news on campus with our faculty and staff, off campus, which is typically through the media, building in this era, building web content, so it's available on the university's website, making sure that our Board of Regents are apprised with what we do. So when we have a major announcement, we really think about those audiences, those core audiences of the university, and our planning will be how we take that news across those audiences so that they're all aware. So it can be complex, but then after doing it for as many years as I've done it, there's a bit of a model behind it that's proven and is good to follow.
Let me ask you something that's just
Sure.
interested me. Were you or are you involved in the media videos that appear in football game commercials when our teams or basketball go out of town?
I have been involved in some video work at the university. So again, the university it's like a little city itself, and so for communications, there is a communications function that supports athletics. There's a communications function that supports cooperative extension. I was in the communications function at the Central University, so there's a number of pockets of communicators. So you probably wouldn't have seen my work so much at a Wolfpack Athletics event, but you would have more seen my work in the media coverage around the university, and certainly on the website and in publications. I was an editor of Nevada Silver and Blue magazine for several years as well.
Oh, wow. Jane, you're in a pretty high-stress job, and you've always been in communications. What motivates you to keep you going and keep you getting better and better?
That's a very thoughtful question. So what has motivated me in my career is that very fortunately, I've been able to be in roles where I'm contributing to something bigger. I suppose you might call it mission-driven or purpose-driven kind of work. I didn't really realize when I first started in my career that would resonate with me so strongly, but it definitely has resonated with me over my career, and by all means resonates with me today. So I'm in a communications director role at the university now, and have been for a little more than a decade. But it's really a pleasure and an honor to be a part of an organization that's really making sure that there's access for young people, educational access in our state, that we have an organization that's contributing to the economy, contributing to the future generations of the state. So again, I find that very motivating to be in a role where I feel very good about the larger mission that we're serving. And it's also been a time of momentum at the university, and I will say that that's motivating as well. So as I said, I've been at the university a little over a decade. There was a period of time where we had to sustain some incredibly deep budget cuts, very deep, very challenging for us as communicators, how you communicate that to people who are impacted, people who are losing their jobs, and sort of managing a communication program around that. So I've been there, I've seen those darker days, and yet coming out of that, the university has grown in terms of the enrollment size, the quality of education, what the campus looks like. I mean, it's remarkable to even think about how far it's come in a relatively short time out of those budget cuts. But I have to say that has been motivating to me to be a part of an organization that's building, growing, getting together. Makes you want to get up and go to work in the morning.
And how do you relieve stress of the everyday office?
I don't know that I always do it all that well, but home life is important to me. I've come to learn a lot about what does create stress for me and to manage that a bit. One thing about our role as communicators, we can have something happen in an instant. It can be I could use the example of a crisis maybe at the university, although there are other things that could prompt this. But we could have something that happens in an instant, and that's what you're going to do today. You're going to do it tonight. You're going to work. It's going to feel like you're going to come close to working around the clock. You may deal with it for months. So for a long time, I will say that that was actually a real stressor for me, these unexpected things that happen, and yet it's a very real part of what we do. And so I really just kind of come to learn and to train myself that to make my job a mix of things that I can plan and organize, and yet knowing that I need to keep a good part of my day free, because dealing with the unexpected is part of what we do.
Do you have athletic activities or things that you participate in?
I've always loved to get out and walk. I love my dogs and get out and spend time with my dogs. We like to, there's a lot of areas near Reno that are near and dear to my husband and I, such as the Gray Eagle area. We like to get out there. I love to read. I love to read fiction. And all of that is really a break and a stress reliever for me.
Well, that brings us to our next subject, which is, are there any books that have been important to you, or videos, or types of things that have helped you in your career?
There's a couple of books that have been important to me and come to mind immediately. One is a book called Good to Great by Jim Collins, which is really a leadership development book, but just a tremendous book. You know, when I think about this idea of a book that's important to me, I have to say that what I kind of go to fairly quickly is even the idea of a professional organization. I've been very involved in the Public Relations Society of America, really since the start of my career. And that has been very important to me. It's really coming together with colleagues in the community. Many of us that are in these roles, we all know one another because we're active in PRSA. It values professional development. It values ethical practices. So we have the opportunity to think about that, to talk about that. What does ethics mean in our profession and how we come together? And then the organization also gives back to the younger generation. That's definitely ingrained in the organization. So when I was thinking about this question of what's been important to me in terms of reading or books, a lot of it has been what's come to me through that particular professional organization.
With that in mind, you obviously had role models and mentors and folks that inspired you, as well as your organizations. Who were some of those people?
I have to say I am blessed to have had many, many extraordinary role models in my life, and mentors as well. I could probably do a several-hour interview about this, but won't. But I have to start with my parents in terms of role models, and share a story with you about my mother. She was a teacher. She was a daughter of Basque immigrants, and she was fluent in Spanish because her parents spoke Basque, but Spanish was also a language that they shared with their Basque friends. So my mother was fluent in Spanish. So when we were growing up, my mother was a teacher, and she and a teacher in Winnemucca started what I believe were the first. They were at least very close to the first English as a second language programs in Nevada schools, and that was in Pershing County and in Humboldt County. And so for the students that they were working with, if you were in an urban area, that might mean that you're dealing with students who speak many different languages. But in our communities, it was Spanish. And also in our communities, these were far and away children of immigrants who had come to the area to work in agriculture. And so what happened with my mother, because she knew these families, she knew their kids, she got to know their parents, she really became almost a de facto social worker in our community. When they were in trouble, they called our house. When they were experiencing maybe something that I would even call some kind of a racial tension or a problem of that sort, they called our house. And then over the years, my mother, because she became close to so many of the parents, and especially the women, the mothers of these children, she started to create a class, which was her own idea, but it was a class to teach them to sort of understand society and to just to understand how to navigate in the world in the United States. For example, they would learn how to open a bank account, how to write a check. Those were things that she would do. And then she ended up getting connected with some of the statewide literacy efforts and folded literacy in. She would be dealing with women who, maybe a group of women who, some would be here from Mexico with degrees, and there would be others who would be illiterate. She would be matching them up so that they could be teaching one another. Those who were literate could be teaching others how to read. And it was a magnificent program. And my mother ended up being inducted in the Nevada Women's Hall of Fame for this program that she created on her own that continued for many years out there. So when you think about a role model, that's the woman I grew up with, who was just so beloved in the community and so connected to the community and always did the right thing. My father was a very good ethical businessman. The value of a handshake meant everything to him. So again, couldn't have had a better role model in my life than my father. And I always think about my Basque grandmother, who talked about health and happiness. She wasn't interested in things. It was really lived a simple life, and she was very important to us as well. But fast forwarding ahead and staying on the theme of role models and mentors, I have to comment on Lynn Atchison. So many points of my careers had a touch point to Lynn. Early on, I was at Harrah's, and she was building a community relations program there. Those of us who worked for Lynn say, if you have an office next to or near Lynn, you're going to end up doing volunteer work. You're going to end up doing good things for the community, and that was the case for me. So that was very meaningful for me. And then she moved on to Washoe Health System, approached me about moving over to Washoe Health System and interviewing for a job with her there. But I learned a great deal from her about that we can go about our work, but we can always have that thread of what are we doing for the community and how are we serving the community. And then Lynn was just a valuable mentor for me. She, and for many other young women as well. She would help us think about organizations to get involved in. She would give us coaching on a very personal level. She wasn't afraid to tell someone what she thought we might want to think about working on. So she was just invaluable to me as a mentor.
You mentioned university journalism.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And who was that?
So a very important mentor to me as well at the university was John Broder, who some in Reno will remember because he was a Renoite. He had a public relations firm called Broder Martin. I don't think John taught at the university very long. I think he might have only taught there 2 or 3 years, but they were the 2 or 3 years that I was there. And he just opened my eyes to what public relations is as a profession, that it's grounded, it should be grounded in principles, it should be grounded in ethics. It's not spin, which is a word that sometimes gets attached to it. So I came out of the journalism school and did an internship with John and then did some project work for him. That was really my first job out of the university. But John Broder went on and formed an agency in the Boston area. He actually went back to Harvard to get an advanced degree there and ended up staying in the Boston area and starting an agency there. And that agency's been recognized as one of the top 10 public relations agencies in the country. So that just gives you an indication of the caliber of his work. And I just feel so blessed to have been at the journalism program in a time when he was there and could be my mentor.
Obviously, there are good and bad experiences that make a person grow.
Mm-hmm.
What have you learned from your life experiences, both successes and failures?
So, what have I learned through life experiences? The death of my father comes to mind. He, at this time, he died a little over 4 years ago. And I learned that there are some things that happen in your life where you don't grieve for a year, you don't grieve for 2 years, you just have a hole in your heart, and you learn to live with it. But I will say, relative to my career in communications and in public relations, I have, fortunately or unfortunately, I've done a lot of work around what we would consider crisis communication or long-term issue management. And those kinds of experiences really challenge you. I've been talking about that that it's a profession that needs to be rooted in principles and rooted in ethics. But when you're in a situation when it's crisis-oriented, you have to make decisions so quickly and you have to move so quickly that it can challenge you in terms of how grounded you are. And so I've learned a lot, and in my role as a director and having a team of people that I worked with, we've always tried to make that as part of the conversation when we come out of a time like that, to talk about what did we learn. And so I don't just mean what did we learn about, did we write that well, or did that particular newsletter work, did that news channel work, but what did we learn in terms of our values and our practices, and what would we change if we did this again. But yes, I've been through many experiences as a communications professional that have helped root that idea of always learning and asking, what have we learned, how can we improve? I've had many experiences that we call crisis communications. In my line of work, we sometimes use the phrase issue management. We may deal with a situation or a tough issue that we may be dealing with it for months on some issues. They're not short-term issues. So we tend to call that issue management, and crisis management really is where something hits and we're out the door working on it, but it may be shorter in duration. We learn from every one of those experiences, but maybe to talk about a couple at the university, because it's a big, complex place. You could almost think of the university as a little city of its own in some respects. So we've had some challenging situations. For example, student deaths. Immensely challenging situations where somebody at the university is making a call to a parent, and someone in our department, typically me, is talking to the media and thinking about, what do we say? What do we not say? Where is this story sort of in terms of the life of the story? What should be revealed? What shouldn't be revealed at that particular point in time? So we were talking off camera about a situation that we dealt with that was immensely challenging, and it was a flood situation in Reno, and the university has a main station farm out in the east side of Reno. And during that flood situation, the whole city media was pretty much nonstop, because our community was watching the flood, watching the rains, watching the snow melt, thinking about how this was going to impact our homes. Were the rivers and creeks going to come up? But the major incident that came up was flooding out at the main station farm, and 300 sheep drowned and died. And so that became really the centerpiece of that flood event, the centerpiece, I say, in terms of where the media focus was. And it was also a time for the university where there had been some other questions that had come up about animals that were in the care of the university. So that particular event happened at a time when Joe Crowley was back at the helm. He was interim president at the university at the time, and I adored working with Joe, and we've ended up being very good friends after having worked together. But we immediately went into, I guess, that toolbox of what are the principles and ethical practices that one would follow. We knew that the situation was unfolding out at the main station farm. We didn't know how many sheep had died. But we went to the media very quickly. First of all, we went to the city officials who were planning the flood. We went to the media very quickly with the fact that was happening. And really kind of followed the idea that when you're in crisis communication, there's a demand for information, but it's unfolding. And so we only can say what we know. You don't speculate at that point in time, but you can also start to create sort of milestones to say, we'll be back to you with more information in several hours. We'll be back to you with more information in a day. But very early on in that episode, one of the things that we emphasized was this idea that the university was going to shoulder the responsibility to take a good hard look at what happened, how did it happen, and make sure that it never happened again. We've had flooding events since then that haven't flooded the farm. The sheep have all been on the hill. Had it flooded the farm, I'm confident that it wouldn't have happened. So again, we folded that into the communications and public relations response, that we say, what do we know, but that almost immediately we're starting to say, and what we can do as an organization to respond in the short term, but respond in the long term as well.
And what are some of your high points, those points that you just think about and smile?
So a high point from my career. I've been at the university a little over a decade. I've actually worked for 4 presidents at this point. Some might be surprised to even stop and think that we've had 4 university presidents over that period of time. But there were 5 years when our university president was Milt Glick, and I worked very closely with him. I was a part of his inauguration, and I would have to say that the tenure with Milt Glick was a high point for me. He could be an unusual man, but when it came to communications, he was very forthright. He was very transparent. He never ducked the media. We never turned down an interview. He did it as it should be done, and it was really a pleasure to be a part of that. But it was also a period of time where the university moved into the ranking through U.S. News and World Report as being in the top tier of best national universities. We were seeing enrollment growth every year. We had some buildings that at one point in time were just envisioned, but they were coming to be. There were major gifts that were happening around those buildings. And so it was just really a remarkable time because it was, I guess I could say the university was firing on all cylinders. Things were coming together. At the start of his career, the university shouldered significant budget cuts. And it was really remarkable for me to look back and think that over a window of, say, 5 or 6 years, we went from shouldering significant budget cuts, hundreds of people lost their job, to 5 or 6 years later, really experiencing the kind of growth, not just in size, but in quality at the university that we've been able to experience. It wouldn't surprise me if you said an organization could do that in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. But it really turned around in the university fairly quickly in about 5 or 6 years. And I think that was because we had strong leaders with good strategic thinking skills at the top. So thinking about challenging times, another one certainly was the death of University President Milt Glick. And I was communications director at the time. I got a call from Mark Johnson, who's university president today, but he was the provost at the time, so he was in the number 2 role. And that call came in on a weekend morning, 7 o'clock in the morning. And so 2 immediate reactions. One, we had a team of people that assembled and we had just lost a friend. And so this was personally emotional for us. But we had to manage the communications around it as well. And we knew we had to manage that in a way that thinks about our different audiences, our faculty and staff on campus, our students adored him. Our community, our alumni, and how we share that news, and really what's the narrative that we want to tell. So obviously his legacy and what he had accomplished in higher ed, we wanted to honor that and have that be a part of the news and information that came out about his passing. But we also wanted to instill confidence. So it could be very likely that for an organization of that size and that complexity, and when you lose the guy that's at the top of the helm, it could leave people feeling like, oh my gosh, what's happening next? And we wanted to convey that the university is sure-footed and was prepared to move forward. So very early on in that, Chancellor Dan Claich stepped in, and he really took the helm on a short-term basis with Mark Johnson's support, and then very soon after that, Mark Johnson was named interim president. That might seem obvious, but again, it was a very strategic decision that was made to make sure that as we were sharing the news of his death, we were already prepared to say, and here is how the university is going to move on. So there are some organizations and settings where the communications function or the public relations function can be, or maybe even needs to be, about a control of information or defining messages and staying on message. Maybe to take that to an extreme, if you think about the shows we watch on Sunday morning in the political realm, you really see that idea of they've got message points, they're sticking on message points, and they're not moving off of those message points. For me at the university, it's far different. It's a public university. It's not our university, it's the community's university. We're really stewards of the university. It's complex. There's, even in terms of social media, communication is ongoing. It's never stopping. So our role really is about facilitating communication and not controlling communication. And so I think for individuals who have been at the university thinking that maybe they don't want to be responsive to the media, or they think that they can control the message, it can be challenging for them. But for me, it's been very liberating and fun that you're part of the conversation. Joe Crowley wrote a book about being a university president at a public university, and the name of the book is A Constant Conversation. And I love that. I love that title, and that's what being in a communications role at the university is like. We are in a constant conversation. We're not controlling communication, we're facilitating it.
I know that you are of Basque heritage. Has that influenced you in any way? And I want you to step in your family and then outside, and tell me how you would like to be remembered outside of the importance of your family.
Okay. My Basque heritage is very important to me, and I have to say it's more important to me as the older I get. So my mother was the daughter of Basque immigrants who came to this country, a sheep herder and a servant. They met and married in this country. I had my mother and her brother. My mother grew up in Battle Mountain. I grew up in Lovelock. And in Lovelock, we really didn't have an active Basque community. We didn't have the Basque dancing or the Basque festivals that you see in other communities. But my grandmother lived down the street. And so I really saw that, I guess I saw the world with her through her immigrant eyes, someone who didn't speak English when she came here, always had a heavy accent, was often greeted by people who were seemed to maybe look down on her because she had such a heavy accent. So I saw that side of things. And yet I also saw just a really goodness of heart that she brought, and that so many immigrants bring to our country, just these good, hardworking people who are so dedicated to wanting to create a better life for their children and their grandchildren. My brother and sister and I have looked back on that. My grandfather, again, who was a sheep herder, every year he would give us a small savings bond. I want to say it was maybe like a $5 savings bond, because he wanted us to set it aside to grow and to go so that we could go to college. Well, having a handful of $5 saving bonds is not going to send someone to college. But I look back on that and think about the power of having someone in our life who said, I want you to go to college. It was setting the expectation. And then thinking about what he came from, where he didn't have the opportunity to finish high school or to get a high school degree, and yet he was so focused on wanting his grandchildren to go to college. So that kind of lifestyle and I guess value system was very important to me. So for me, I guess it was maybe more, that might be more the immigrant story than the Basque story. But in later years, I've had the opportunity to go to Spain and to the Basque country a few times. My grandparents never went back, and we've met family members that they left and never saw again. In many instances, it's the children of their siblings, and that has been just amazingly rewarding, and how they have embraced us and just think of us as family and how welcoming they've been. So it's been important to me because of those travel experiences. So that idea of going back to the home country has been documented in books like Robert Laxalt's Sweet Promised Land. I think it's very meaningful for many people of Basque descent who have gone back, but I really think it applies to so many of so many different particularly European countries, but really it's the immigrant story of going back where our forefathers or where prior generations came from. But it was very meaningful for me, and immensely meaningful for my mother, who grew up in this country never knowing her grandparents, her aunts, her uncles, her cousins, and didn't go back to the Basque country until after her mother died, and didn't know what she would encounter, and then was just greeted so warmly. So it's really, it's been wonderful.
And outside your family, how would you like to be remembered as far as importance in communicating your values and what you have accomplished.
How would I like to be remembered? You know, I often think that we are so lucky that there are people on this earth, the Lynn Atchisons of the world, who take on big things, big causes. When I think about how I want to be remembered, it's funny how I find myself thinking about maybe smaller moments and smaller interactions. But what would be especially meaningful for me is to have people who have worked with me who feel that their career has progressed, or to feel that they were better or stronger or grew in their jobs because they had the opportunity to interact with me. I think that that's really the most meaningful aspect to me, and it's more that I think more that instead of wanting to be remembered by a wider community, just to hopefully be in a place where there's a few people, maybe a few dozen people, who would say that their lives are better because I was in it. I've had people who have given so much to me in terms of role modeling and mentorship, and so the idea of being able to perhaps giving that back to other individuals is very meaningful.
Jane, you've been accomplished in your career. There are many young women coming up. What would be your message for a young woman entering into adulthood and a possible career?
That's a very good question. To really focus in on what would be a core message for young women who are entering their career. And so what I would say now, from my vantage of being 30 plus years into my career, it's a journey, not a destination. And it took me a while to learn that. I think there's sometimes there's a sense that you've got to accomplish a lot and you've got to accomplish it quickly, but you've got plenty of time. There's going to be times in life where you're going to have things that you predicted and sought out and they happen to you. There's going to be times in life when things happen to you that you didn't expect to happen. So there's got to be some flexibility. But I think it's just that ability to recognize that it's a journey. It's not a destination. And then along the way, to really have some focused thinking about what energizes you and what are your core values. I think it takes time to answer that question, but once you do, that can become cyclical. You come to understand what energizes you, and then you can find and build more of that into your life. But I think that would really be my core message, is to look at it as a journey, and then through that journey just to be open to thinking about what energizes you and what are the values that you really lean on to carry you through.
I've really enjoyed this interview immensely.
Thank you.
And thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure visiting with you, Patty. Thank you.